Welcome to you all this afternoon. We're delighted to have Paul Kaplan here, Professor Paul Kaplan, with us today. He is a professor of art history at the School of Humanities at Purchase College. There we are, where he has been professor since 1988. And he got his PhD from Boston University. He's the author of The Rise of the Black Magus in Western Art and numerous essays on European images of black Africans and Jews and on political, military, and festing imagery in Venetian art, especially in the work of Giorgione, Titian, and Veronese. In 2008 and again in 2012, he was a fellow at the Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research at Harvard University, and he's a major contributor to the volumes 2, 3, and 4 of the Harvard University Press's new edition of The Image of the Black in Western Art. That's 2010-12. He was one of the consultants for revealing the African presence in Renaissance Europe. Some of you may have seen that wonderful exhibition at the Walters Art Gallery and also at Princeton in 2012-13. And he's also been involved with NYU's project Resignifications, European Blackamoors exhibition project opening in 2015. His current work includes research on the role of black Africans in Venetian art and society, the changes in European images of black Africans around 1600, and the intersections of race and art in the writings of 19th century American and British visitors to Italy. So I think you can understand why he's the ideal speaker for today in connection with our little focus show here at the museum in Gallery 624 on Cranach's St. Maurice. Today, Professor Kaplan will speak to us on Cranach's St. Maurice and the representation of Africans in 16th century German art. So please welcome Professor Kaplan.
First, I want to extend my thanks to Maryan Ainsworth for inviting me to give this talk in conjunction with a truly delightful small exhibition that has highlighted Cranach's image of St. Maurice and provided the picture with an extensive and a revealing historical context. The exhibition particularly emphasizes issues of conservation and, above all, the painting's close relationship to the cult of relics, which particularly flourished in northern Germany in the early 1500s, but which was soon to come to an abrupt close as a result of the Reformation. My purpose this afternoon is to provide another sort of context, the strong and varied German tradition of representing dark-skinned Africans, usually as pious or otherwise admirable figures, stretching back many centuries into the medieval period, but particularly pronounced during the early part of, or the middle part, I should say, of Lucas Cranach's career in the early 1500s. Another part of my agenda is to convince you that the Met possesses an especially impressive selection of European Renaissance images of Africans. I've taught courses on this subject up at Purchase College in Westchester for many years, always dispatching my students to the Met and to the cloisters in search of relevant images, and they've returned with rich observations on dozens of individual works of art. Now, I'm going to show a great many images in the next 45 or 50 minutes, many unearthed with the help of Harvard University's Image of the Black in Western Art research project. Harvard has now published 10 volumes in this series, to which, as Maryan said, I have myself contributed. In those volumes, there is a wealth of textual information. Not all, but many of the images that you see here can also be found in the volumes on Renaissance art, 3 parts of volume 3. But I want to warn you that I'm not a fan of including a lot of text on my slides. So if you'd like to know more about any work, either speak to me after the talk or email me at paul maurice.kaplan at purchase, P-U-R-C-H-A-S-E, .edu, and I'll be happy to send you further identifying information. Cranach's Maurice, made in the early 1520s and now beautifully cleaned, depicts an elegantly outfitted young black African knight. Maurice's legend was well known in the Middle Ages, an Egyptian commander in the Roman imperial army, and a Christian at a time when the religion was still being persecuted by Roman authorities. He's said to have been martyred along with many of his troops for refusing to kill other Christians. The early versions of his life and exploits make no reference to the color of his skin. Cranach and his assistants show Maurice here with an imperial eagle on his banner, but both that eagle and the splendid armor show links to the Christian Holy Roman Empire, founded by Charlemagne in 800, and in the 1520s, ruled by Charles V of Habsburg. The Knightly Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by one of Charles' forebears and promoted by him, is visible in several places on Maurice's armor. And let me try out my laser pen here. Is that making the mark, or am I just too slow? I'm not seeing it do it. I think maybe I'll use the cursor. So here is a little golden fleece, and these emblems on the shoulders also connect to the order. We will soon return to the armor, but first I want to describe the markers of black African identity specified by Cranach. Maurice's dark brown complexion is clearly vital here. There we go. However, the infrared reflectograms of the underdrawing of Maurice on the left and another white saint from a different picture, painted around this time by Cranach, this comparison helps us to see more clearly the other markers of his African identity. Tightly curled hair, a sort of snub nose with a low bridge, and at least slightly fuller lips than you can see on, I think it's St. Barbara there. These are the fundamental signs, with complexion, of black Africanness in European art of the period, and in fact, we can trace them back as far as the 1200s. Okay. For example, this head, carved in a dark gray stone and found in Lucera, in Apulia in southeast Italy, displays not only the color, but also hair, nose, and lips of a similar type. The nose and lips are more emphatic in the medieval sculpture than they are in Cranach's underdrawing. A somewhat finer carved capital, also probably from Lucera, and also from the early 1200s, is in the Met's collections. And one of the four heads ornamenting it shows similar physiognomic details, though color is absent. Perhaps it was originally painted, but we don't know that. Both these sculptures are probably connected to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, ruled 1212 to 1250, a German who was, however, raised in South Italy. Frederick and his troops suppressed the few remaining Muslim enclaves on the island of Sicily after 1220 and settled many of these people several hundred miles away in Lucera, where the Met capital and the other head have come from. Among the 16,000 Muslims settled at Lucera were many people of color, descendants of sub-Saharan Africans who had lived in North Africa as both slaves and free people. And Frederick used some of his black African subjects, who were not universally forced to convert to Christianity, many remained Muslims, as favored court servants. In the 1230s, a large wall painting was made to adorn a chamber next to the church of San Zeno in Verona, in northern Italy on the route to the Alpine passes leading from Italy to Germany. And in this chamber, Frederick sometimes stayed. And this work shows 4 black Africans among a group of 29 people, 29 peoples of the world, paying homage to the emperor. While the other groups are in threes, there are 4 black Africans who are made very visible near the head of the line through their skin color and tightly curled hair. A half-century earlier, in 1181, an unmistakably dark-skinned woman had appeared in Nicholas of Verdun's Klosterneuburg altarpiece for a church near Vienna, in the person of the Queen of Sheba visiting and admiring King Solomon. Sheba here is dark, her 2 attendants are not. Sheba has been variously identified as a kingdom in southern Arabia or East Africa. This is the earliest image I know of in which she is shown as African, though here only her complexion suggests this. Features of the face do not particularly. Now, around 1240, the earliest known image of St. Maurice as a black African was produced for the Cathedral of Magdeburg in northern Germany, where it still stands. Magdeburg was a city allied with Emperor Frederick II, and we know he brought African retainers with him, and as we know he brought black African retainers with him on his trips to Germany. It's quite likely that Frederick's penchant for emphasizing his African subjects had an effect on this new kind of imagery. Frederick clearly used the unfamiliar complexions and features of his black subjects to assert his claimed right to rule the entire world. And a black Saint Maurice, a soldier saint favored by many earlier Holy Roman emperors, even before he was represented as black, Maurice was a favorite of the emperors. A black Saint Maurice makes sense in the light of this. While one text from the 1100s suggests that the Egyptian Maurice was a king of Morinland, the land of the Moors, the term does not always designate black Africans, that term Moor, but also frequently Moor signifies North Africans and even Muslims in general. So prior textual evidence in no way unequivocally asserts that Maurice had dark skin. And the Magdeburg Maurice is really the first image to do so, notably including complexion, treatment of lips, and perhaps nose shape. It's a bit hard to say because of damage here as identifying factors. Even Maurice's tightly curled hair might be alluded to in the chainmail helmet. Okay, makes sense as a helmet in this form, but it also could resemble the kind of hair given to Africans by European artists. The next notable image of Maurice as a black African dates to the 1360s, so more than a century later, in a work produced for one of Frederick's successors as Holy Roman Emperor, Charles IV of Luxembourg. In his chapel of the Holy Cross in his castle of Karlstein near Prague, Charles commissioned the skillful painter Master Theodoric to depict many of the saints whose relics he possessed, including Maurice. I want you to note the relic connection, which will turn up again, of course, later. In the course of the 1300s, other images of the Black Maurice began to appear, especially around Magdeburg and the nearby city of Halle. But interestingly, other black African saints, including Saint Gregor Maurus, Saint Gregory the Moor, who you see here, also developed in areas of northwestern Germany where Maurice was not especially popular. This work in stained glass is from Cologne. A certain urge to include a black saint seems evident all across these North German regions. We now need to turn, however, to another sacred subject, including one or more black Africans, which was destined to become far more important than Maurice or Gregor in German and indeed in European art. This is the story of the three magi, also known as the wise men, also known as the three kings, which developed from a brief and vague account in the Gospel of Matthew into a major and often elaborate subject for European artists in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. At first, beginning with a sculpture by the famed Nicola Pisano from about 1266 for the pulpit of Siena Cathedral on the left, black Africans were only shown in the entourage of the Magi. Here we see two black African men riding dromedaries, but they're part of the entourage. The kings are shown in transit. Here you can see one of them, and then kneeling before the Christ child up there. But the kings, with typically European features, do not resemble the men on the camels. This work, interestingly enough, was carved while Frederick II's grandson, the German prince Conradin, was staying in Siena, and again may be a reference to the Africans in the Hohenstaufen imperial entourage. By the early 1300s, several other Italian artists included what I refer to as black African Magian attendants, as in this curious work on the right, with three tiny African figures, and the cursor is already there so you can see them, which is now in the Lehman collection here at the Met. This is a work I've frequently sent my students to puzzle out. They've come up with some interesting theories, but nothing conclusive. In the late 1300s, the North German religious writer John of Hildesheim, in an expansive account of the Magi's story, called The History of the Three Kings, confidently asserted that one of the three kings themselves was unquestionably, he said, a black African. By the early 1400s, German painters had begun to follow John's claims. One of the most influential examples was Hans Mulcher's panel from a 1437 work known as the Wurzach altarpiece, which was probably actually made for a church in Landsberg in southern Germany. Note that the elegant white-robed wise man is accompanied by several other dark-skinned men in a crowd of Magian attendants, bringing Nicola Pisano's earlier imagery into a German artwork. So the African king here, but then several other faces mixed together with paler faces behind. After 1437, hundreds, and counting what's been lost, probably thousands of other German and then more broadly European paintings, prints, and sculptures include the black African magus and often his attendants as well. On the right is a lovely example in painted wood sculpture, now at the cloisters, made in Germany in the late 1480s. Another example of German painted wood sculpture has recently been added to the Met's collection. This is on the left, dating to the early 1500s. And one of the Met's treasures in the category of Netherlandish painting, Quentin Massis's early 16th century Adoration, features a wonderful and unusually light-skinned African ruler. Though this figure may well be based on a drawing from life, enslaved Africans were arriving on Portuguese ships in Antwerp, Massis's base, in greater numbers by this time. You'll note that lips and nose are certainly treated in a way now familiar to us. By 1520, artists all across Europe, from France to Poland and Italy to the Netherlands, had adopted the originally Germanic idea of the black African wise man. And by the way, it spread to Spain, and from Spain it went to the New World, where there are many such images from Latin America. The most famous of all German artists, Albrecht Dürer, produced several influential representations of the black magus in both painting and prints. This is a large picture now in Florence, made in 1504 for one of the most important North German princes, Duke Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Frederick the Wise is extensively discussed in the current Met exhibition, and he was a major rival as both a collector of art and the relics of saints. He was a major rival in these capacities to the probable patron of the Met's Cranach painting, Albrecht of Brandenburg. Frederick was not especially attracted to St. Maurice, but he was clearly devoted to the Magi. The Magi, by the way, were not exactly saints, as they had come to Christ before he was an adult, before Christ really directly attracted disciples. But the relics of the Magi were collected. Mostly they were in Cologne Cathedral. And in the visual arts, they were typically treated as if they were saints. Durr's picture includes a very conspicuous black African magus, as well as an African Magian attendant shown in some detail at the right. As in most, but not all German and more generally European images, the African wise man is shown as the youngest of the three and third in line, which implies a kind of racial hierarchy. All three men are about to kneel and worship the pink-fleshed Christ child, conveying a message of European power as well. But Durr's black magus, like many others, is nevertheless a poised and aristocratic figure. And let me bring you in a little closer. Right? He wears the dress of European elites with his red leggings, dark cape streaked with a band of gold, and red hat held in his hand with a jaunty feather. Surprisingly, his attendant at the right has lighter skin, though his lips and nose denote sub-Saharan identity. And while the magus is in European dress, the attendant wears a Middle Eastern turban of a type associated with the Ottoman Empire. So the color hierarchy of the Magi is somewhat turned on its head when focusing on the magus and his servant. One marker of otherness, non-European identity, beyond complexion and physiognomy, can be found on Durr's young wise man. He wears a round earring, an adornment not yet fashionable among European Christians, but often worn by Jews and Africans in the art of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. The face of Durr's black wise man is similar in some respects to that of Cranach's Maurice, and we will see other versions of it in the German art of the early 1500s. In 1507, one of Durr's most gifted students, Hans Baldung, produced a triptych with the Adoration of the Magi on its central panel. Though not that closely related compositionally to Durr's picture that we just saw, Baldung created a finely dressed, if slightly stiff, black magus. What makes his work singular is that one of the wings of the altarpiece shows the black Saint Maurice. It is in fact quite rare to combine the black magus and the black Maurice in their function, denoting the hoped-for attraction of all the world's peoples to Christianity. They duplicate each other. And here Maurice kind of drowns out the magus in scale and in splendor. Maurice is paired instead on the other wing with a blonde Nordic St. George, and Baldung has situated the black magus next to George rather than Maurice. Maurice is a major figure here because the altarpiece was made for Ernst von Wetten, Archbishop of Magdeburg, whose home church was the center of the cult of Maurice, and also the home of that first medieval sculpture of the black Maurice that I showed earlier on. Please note the imperial eagle on Maurice's banner, reminiscent of the banner in the Cranach picture. Maurice's head, actually let me go back up. Maurice's head here almost looks like an emblem on the banner itself. And this is the right moment to say a bit more about heraldic depictions of black Africans. These begin to appear around 1300 in both Germany and Mediterranean lands. The recently retired German Pope, Benedict, had the head of a black African on his official coat of arms, derived from the long-standing emblem of Freising in Bavaria, where he'd served early on in his career. Here are two fascinating heraldic images from the 1520s. On the left, a Swiss coat of arms in stained glass with an earringed black woman as a heraldic supporter, propping up the family shield. On the right is Durer's personal coat of arms, Albrecht Durer's personal arms, in a woodcut he made in 1526 over a door, Tur, pun on Durer's name. We see the upper part of the body of an African between enormous wings. The African, as is generally true of Durer's drawings and prints, does not show a dark complexion. Light and dark in a woodcut generally show form rather than local hue, right? But lips and nose make his identity clear, and he also wears an earring and a Phrygian cap, in ancient times a symbol of a freed slave. Several elite families in Durer's native Nuremberg used a black figure like this one in the crest of their coat of arms, and Durer's father had adopted it for their family, but we are not entirely sure why, even today. Now, Durer, I should make clear, deploys black African figures in his works in a wide variety of roles. Above is a drawing, a study for some perhaps never completed work, in which a black African executioner prepares to decapitate St. Catherine of Alexandria in Egypt. He is then a kind of inverted Maurice, an Egyptian African, not refusing to kill Christians, but ready to kill a Christian. And there are many such figures of executioners and torturers with African features or complexion in European art of this time. Now, below, in another Durer drawing, is a range of human faces in profile. Durer was kind of obsessed with defining what beauty is in the human face, although he eventually gave up on the problem. But in one of his writings, he actually asserted that the faces of Africans were ugly, though he admired their bodies. Here, he shows two rather exaggerated black African faces at the far end of a set that begins with a more normative European type. However, two brilliant drawings by Durer show the faces of African subjects with a quiet assurance and, I would say, beauty. Both appear to have been drawn from life, the man in charcoal and the woman in the demanding medium of silver point. In neither case does he use skin color as a marker, but lips, nose, and in the case of the man, hair are all important. The woman on the right is identified by Durer as Caterina, 20 years old, and dated 1521. We know from Durer's diary that he met and drew her at the house of her employer, the Portuguese business representative to the cosmopolitan Netherlandish port city of Antwerp, now in Belgium. Caterina was a domestic servant. Given her youth, she may well have been a slave. The Portuguese were heavily involved in this trade in human beings at the time, but we can't be sure, as a free black community of former slaves and their offspring was also beginning to develop. Neither of these people are saints, but they exude a humanity common to Durer's other portraits. Ever since the time of Frederick II, European elites had maintained a preference for including black Africans among their followers at court, though this fashion had generally been more widespread in Spain, Italy, and France than in German lands. By the early 1500s, however, it looks as if the Habsburgs, based in what is now Austria, but soon to be Europe's most powerful family, had adopted this fashion. That may explain the presence of black African figures in two Netherlandish paintings, the region west of Germany, had recently come under Habsburg control. So here's the first of these. Jan Mostert, the author of this picture from the early 1520s, was often employed by Margaret of Austria, the Habsburg regent of the Netherlands, and the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. And a man called Christophe le Moor, Christopher the Moor, was attached to Margaret's court. While we can't be sure this is a portrait of him, It is surely a portrait of someone in particular, a man who in his dress, note his sword and decorative purse, seems a man who seems to be of relatively elevated status. The badge on his hat represents his, emphasizes his Christianity as it refers to a pilgrimage site near Brussels. Now, the next image, a miniature painting of the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon, is more securely attached to Margaret of Habsburg. It's from a lavishly decorated prayer book known as the Grimani Breviary, produced by several Netherlandish artists about 1515. It's generally acknowledged that Margaret stands in for the Queen of Sheba herself, who here, of course, is not shown as a black African. But among her 5 ladies in waiting is a dark-skinned woman who may well embody an actual court servant, but who also denotes the exotic origins of the biblical queen's distant kingdom. By 1530, Margaret's nephew, the Emperor Charles V, also had several black African retainers in his entourage, who are depicted in a view of an imperial procession by another Netherlandish artist. But now I want to return to works by German artists, specifically to a large altarpiece painted by an anonymous artist around 1515 to 1520 for the Duke and the Duchess of Kallenberg. This was a work made for the chapel in their castle at the southwestern edge of Saxony, and it's now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The central panel depicts the mystic marriage of St. Catherine. Catherine and Christ putting a ring on her finger, the infant Christ. The mystic marriage of St. Catherine and the Duchess, who was called Catherine of Saxony, is surely shown here just below the saint, who she, in fact, resembles. So this is Duchess Catherine, this is St. Catherine. Behind the Duchess are 4 handsomely dressed ladies in waiting in prayerful postures with hands together in worship. One of these women is marked as of African descent by her complexion, lips, and nose. By itself, this is an interesting detail, especially in the light of the fact that Catherine's grandmother, a Bohemian queen, was presented with a pair of black African slaves by the King of Portugal in the 1460s. However, the dark-skinned woman's presence is made still more intriguing by the fact that the adjoining wing of the altarpiece, which you can see here, is devoted to one of the fullest depictions of St. Maurice and his companions. And I'm showing you here the left side of the central panel with the African woman, and then the St. Maurice panel. And the size relationship is accurate. Maurice here is characterized as more North African or Mediterranean in appearance, but his fellow martyrs, especially this one, are clearly black Africans. Duchess Catherine was the niece of Ernst von Wetten, Archbishop of Magdeburg, who'd commissioned that painting, which combined St. Maurice and the Magi in 1507, and she was also a cousin of the next Archbishop of Magdeburg, Albrecht of Brandenburg, the presumed patron of Cranach St. Maurice here at the Met, about whom you'll soon hear much more. Through these family affiliations, she brought to Kallenberg a preoccupation with both African court servants and African saints. One of the most visually exciting works in the Met exhibition, in any exhibition, I have to say, and I've seen it in several in the last decade, is another detailed painting, smaller than the Kallenberg wing, but far more brilliant in color, of St. Maurice and his companions. It, too, affirms that Africans come in a variety of skin colors and facial features, perhaps a byproduct of the new and more direct access European navigators had to various parts of the African continent by 1510. Here, Maurice is clearly a sub-Saharan type, while his companions vary from much lighter to significantly darker in complexion. The anonymous painter works in a style more typical of southern Germany, but it's likely that the patron was again connected to the area around Magdeburg in the northeast, which remained the center of the cult of the Black Maurice. Nevertheless, this spreading trend of favoring Black African court servants is also reflected in a 1530 painting for the Duchess of Bavaria by Bartel Beham. This is a big picture, and I'm only going to show you a few details. It tells the story of St. Helena's discovery of the true cross, and among Helena's ladies-in-waiting is a rather lovely African woman. Helena, who appears a little further to the right, and you can see here, I apologize for the photo, which is a bit grainy, is almost certainly a portrait of the Duchess of Bavaria, and it seems that Helena's spiritual advisor in early times, Macarius, is actually a portrait of Albrecht of Brandenburg, who was a friend of hers. And notice there's another Black African youth visible near this portrait of Albrecht. We must now turn more directly to Albrecht, the leading patron of images of Africans in Renaissance Germany. As we begin to address Albrecht and his patronage, it makes sense to provide a little geographical guidance. Albrecht was the younger son of the Margrave and Elector of Brandenburg. This is the city of Brandenburg, lands expanded around it, a ruler whose land stretched to the east of the Elbe River, so off in this direction, and whose lands included the city of Berlin, which would be here, at that time still a very modest place. His elder brother Joachim succeeded their father as Margrave and Elector in 1499 when Albrecht was 9 years old. He entered the clergy and rapidly rose in its ranks, becoming Archbishop of nearby Magdeburg, the center of the Black Maurice cult, at the age of 23 in 1513. And here's Magdeburg. Okay. The next year, he was named to an even more prestigious post of Archbishop and Elector of Mainz, and that would be off the map, well, somewhere down here, actually, probably not quite off the map. And in 1518, he became a cardinal, and he just stacked these positions up. He didn't leave one to go to another. This was normal at the time. Electors, I've been using that term, were a small group of German princes and prelates, typically archbishops, who elected each Holy Roman Emperor. So that's an important title. One of Albrecht's favorite residences was in the city of Halle, and Halle is located here, which is not far south of Magdeburg. And like Magdeburg, it had long been attached to the Black version of St. Maurice. This map shows the concentration of known images of Maurice as a Black African, with larger dots for particular concentrations, and you can see that Magdeburg and Halle and some smaller nearby towns constitute the densest zone. Kallenberg, by the way, is off here to the southwest and somewhat isolated. In Halle, Albrecht refounded the local collegiate church, a step below a cathedral, now called the Stiftskirche, lavishly provided for its decoration, and assembled an extremely ambitious collection of saints' relics, with the relics of Maurice specially featured. The relics were housed in precious reliquaries, many made of silver, other precious metals, and the collection was made known to a wide audience through a printed and illustrated book known as the Halsches Heiligtumsbuch. Albrecht also commissioned a precious manuscript, the Liber Ostionis, 1526 to 27, in which his favored artists painted watercolor images of the reliquaries. This is our major record of the collection, which by the 1530s had to be melted down for financial reasons. Here you see a reliquary in the form of a standing figure of Maurice, and one, on the right, of a saint that Albrecht apparently invented, Maurice's pious sister Fides, faithful. This invention makes sense, actually, in the light of Black African women court servants that we've been talking about, who may have desired a saint that they could specially identify with. Now, we're not certain in what year the Grand Reliquary of Maurice was made, but it must have been connected in some way to Matthias Grunewald's famous painting of Saints Erasmus and Maurice from the early 1520s, made for Albrecht for display in the Halle Stiftskirche. This work shows the bishop, Saint Erasmus, with the fleshy features of Albrecht, up here, and Maurice's armor is linked to that of Albrecht's ally, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Habsburg. It's the most famous image of the Black Maurice and must count as one of the most successful examples of Albrecht's art patronage. Here's a view of the Stiftskirche, along with a helpful chart that's now displayed there, in which one can see the many altarpieces commissioned for it, mostly by Lucas Cranach and his shop assistants. And I know you can't see them all too clearly, but here's the Grunewald, and I'm also going to be talking about this one, and I think it's very likely that the Met panel also had a place here. The ones in black and white are sort of projected, lost, or otherwise mislaid works. Maurice figured in many of these, and one of these altarpieces, this one down here, is now in a church on the other side of Halle, the Marktkirche, the market church, originally dedicated to St. Mary. This work, dated 1529, is by Simon Frank, one of the best of Cranach's assistants. St. Maurice appears on the left wing, and you will have noticed that this Maurice is remarkably similar to both the lost reliquary. So here's Simon Frank's Maurice, here's the lost reliquary in the watercolor, and of course, here's the Metz Cranach painting. Clearly, the reliquary served as a model for the paintings and was undoubtedly thought to impart a particular sanctity and splendor to the painted images, as well as affirming, with banner and Order of the Golden Fleece, Albrecht's allegiance to Emperor Charles V, whom he'd in fact helped to elect. This allegiance had recently become more crucial as Albrecht was having to contend with Martin Luther's reforming critiques of the papal church, some of which were particularly directed at Albrecht's spiritual and financial investment in relics and reliquaries. A brief aside about armor. One component of a superb suit of Renaissance armor that's missing here is, of course, the helmet. Were he wearing a helmet in these images, Maurice's identity as an African might be largely concealed. But in another part of Europe in the 1500s, Africans were actually identified specifically with helmets. Right here at the Met, I hope some of you recognize this work by the Venetian painter Paris Bourdon. There's an expansive portrait of a still unidentified general with 2 pages, including an African boy holding the commander's helmet. We know that some North Italian commanders had pairs of black and white pages, but it's not a random choice to have the dark-skinned child holding the general's headpiece. In Italian, one of the common words for helmet is morione. The English version of this word, not terribly current, but used in the past, is Maryan. Though etymologically unrelated to Moor and Moro, there's little doubt that there was an intended pun here between the Moro and the Morione, and I know of at least one other image where a similar pun was explicitly intended. Now, I haven't time to list all the works associated with Albrecht that show the Black Saint Maurice, which, by the way, include various versions of his personal coat of arms, but I want to add one quick further example. This is found in a precious liturgical manuscript made for Albrecht in 1523, known as the Missale Hallense, where in a scene of a church consecration, a conspicuous and probably female Black African observer can be seen. While research has not yet unearthed evidence of Black African retainers in Albrecht's own household, I think it probable that there were some. Now, the same problem about whether we can relate a figure to a living person arises in connection with the work of 1521 commissioned by Albrecht's brother, Margrave and Elector Joachim of Brandenburg. The manuscript illumination by a minor, though skillful Nuremberg artist called Hans Hauser, is a virtually unique example of a black African scholar engaged in writing in European art. The next remotely comparable work dates to the 1770s. The images of Maurice make it clear that there was no conceptual objection to a black African warrior, and indeed in the 1490s, a black African commander in the Venetian armies, a sort of real-life predecessor of Shakespeare's Othello, was famous for his valor, and his family was rewarded by the Venetian government after his death in battle with a hefty pension. But literate and scholarly black Africans did not become a real presence in European life until later in the 1500s, when black clergymen begin to appear in Iberia and Italy, and these figures were never shown actually writing their works. In some cases, we have no images of them at all. So we must presume that Hauser's figure grew out of the particular attention Joachim and his brother Albrecht gave to black Africans. The identity of this scholar is still more surprising. This is an author portrait of a Middle Eastern Jewish astrologer known in Europe as Zabel, who lived in northern Iran and Baghdad in the 800s AD. His work, by the way, is still being published and clearly useful to modern astrologers. The text which follows in his treatise on how to interpret is his treatise on how to interpret various incidental events of daily life in astrological terms. Margrave Joachim, like many Renaissance rulers, was obsessed with astrology, though in his case it was apparently less an issue of the rise and fall of his political fortunes and more connected to another kind of rise and fall. One scholar has said that he was interested in astrology for purposes of obtaining the Viagra effect. Zabel, a Jew who lived at Islamic courts and wrote in Arabic, is never described in any biographical source as dark-skinned or African, but he clearly is here. My best guess is that Joachim, who had recently launched a pogrom against the local Jews, preferred that his artist show Zabel with another kind of otherness. And blackness, as opposed to Jewishness, was clearly the most esteemed kind of otherness for members of his and his brother's family. I want to conclude with one more work from Halle, from the Marktkirche, where Simon Frank's altarpiece with a black Maurice, almost identical to the Metz Cranach, is now located down here. Far above the high altar, there's a colossal painting from the early 1590s by the little-known Hans Lichtenfelser. It's basically the only work of his that's known, which is devoted to many stories from the Acts of the Apostles, the fifth book of the New Testament, when Christ's followers go out to try to convert a larger world. By the 1540s, this church and the others in Halle had gone over to the Lutheran side, and Albrecht had been forced to flee to another part of Germany. Luther and his followers had mixed feelings about sacred paintings, though they did permit them in churches. Post-biblical saints like Maurice were largely excluded from religious imagery, and the cult of Maurice declined precipitously in the Halle area. But there was evidently still a desire to see images of holy black African figures in church. In a conspicuous part of Lichtenfelser's huge painting, the lower left, we see the story of the eunuch of the Queen of Ethiopia, as described in Acts, who encounters the Apostle Philip while he's reading Old Testament prophecies of Isaiah. Interestingly, here we see an African reading, if not writing. And Philip convinces him to become one of the first Christians. Before the 1500s, this story is only occasionally shown, but for both Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation artists, it had a new currency in the later 1500s. We see the eunuch dressed in a mixture of European and Ottoman garb, and his charioteer in European livery, and then the baptism itself. In the increasingly wider world of Christianity in the 1590s, even North German Lutherans wanted to make some claim about the universal reach of Christian ideas, and the Halle audience, more specifically, required some sort of replacement for the black saint they had lost. There is even a fourth and more mysterious African figure just above this scene. I hope then that I have provided some useful context for Cranach's Maurice. And I can't resist one final comparison with a German work. Whoops, good close-up. Cannot resist one final comparison with a German work from around 1600. This is a spectacular silver gilt head of an African, about this big, right? Made by the famous German metalsmith Christoph Jamnitzer for a client who remains unidentified. Like the reliquary on which Cranach's Maurice was based, this is a work in precious metal, and one which can be opened up. You can take off the top of the head. However, no relic was to be found inside. The object is a ceremonial drinking cup. The headband and earring mark the figure as belonging to a more exotic version of an African than Cranach's Maurice, dressed more in European garb. But the object may nevertheless have been, among other things, a reminiscence of Albrecht's lost reliquaries. Thank you.